Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Media Avail. With us is Mayor Don Iveson, who will provide comments on housing. After comments, the Mayor will take questions on housing first, and then address questions on other matters if time permits. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Well, thanks, Chris. First thing I do want to cover is housing. Certainly, I'm sure there'll be questions on a couple of other topics, but let's get the housing done first, and then I'll answer as many other questions as you have. Now, on housing, last week City Council, as you know, passed a motion to address the long-standing issue of homelessness that has again been compounded by the public health risks and economic impacts of COVID-19. Council's unanimously adopted motion seeks to address homelessness by focusing on quickly acquiring existing spaces like hotels and apartments that may have become recently available in these market conditions so that they can be used as temporary housing right away, and so that we can begin to move people out of the cycle of homelessness before this winter. Now, I'm pleased to say that today our message will now be amplified because we're joined by big cities across Canada who are all asking for the same thing. Today, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities launched its effort around affordable housing acquisition in a campaign which proposes a federal initiative consistent with what we've been talking about here, and a partnership to help community housing providers acquire, repair, and retrofit available buildings rapidly for essential nonprofit housing. Most urgently, cities across Canada are suggesting that we convert buildings like motels and hotels into permanent supportive housing so that we can better support Canadians experiencing homelessness, including those living with mental illness and substance use disorders. Now, we know and have advocated long and hard, relentlessly in fact, that this is a more cost-effective measure than any short-term or temporary shelters, and supports key federal objectives to reach or exceed the National Housing Strategy's aim to cut chronic homelessness in half. This plan also bolsters Canada's inclusive economic recovery because repairing, retrofitting, and converting these buildings will support an industry that has been decimated because of COVID-19, namely the hotel, hospitality, and tourism space, while at the same time protecting vulnerable Canadians who happen to be concentrated in our cities, even more so because of COVID-19. So we urgently need permanent, sustainable, supportive housing solutions for vulnerable Canadians, now more than ever. Municipalities are already under immense financial pressure, but sending people back out onto the streets is simply not a solution. People need stable housing to weather the circumstances that put them into that vulnerability. And so today, I'm very pleased to join with Canada's big city mayors and leaders from the Federation of Canadian Municipalities who are amplifying our call from last week and a shared call consistent with all of our long-standing work around homelessness to ask the federal government, as part of its next round of response to COVID-19, to include significant resources for the rapid acquisition of housing that can help us reduce homelessness, and I believe end it in a short fashion here, and prevent this public health crisis from deteriorating tragically in the coming months this winter. So happy to take your questions on that, and then when we're out of housing questions, happy to cover anything else you want to talk about with the audit or with other comments coming forward today from the legislature.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So we have time for, we're going to do one question per media personality, and then we'll get to any if we have extra time. First up is Jeremy Thompson, the CTV.
So, Mr. Mayor, just on the housing piece, you said substantial funding is what you're looking for. Is there sort of a ballpark number, and how do you suppose that funding would best be rolled out? Would it be like a dollar matching sort of thing, or how do you see it working?
I think we're hoping that the federal government will take a leadership position on the acquisition of the units and not try to negotiate with provincial governments for matching funds for acquisition. Provinces are in a very, very tough position, and it was challenging for them to match, and frankly it took way too long to negotiate safe restart, and so I think a matching expectation from provinces for the acquisition of the units would probably be a stretch at this point. The federal government has much more room to maneuver. They will require supports from provinces for the ongoing services to be embedded to make these housing units supportive and successful. We'll leave that for the federal government to work out with their provincial counterparts. But at this point, major federal intervention, and again, this would not enrich the cities because the beneficiaries of this would be the not-for-profit housing providers who would ultimately hold these units, and then the people who would have a safe and warm place to sleep this winter instead. So that's, we don't have a dollar number on that yet because we don't have a sense of what the exact purchasing opportunity would be. Those numbers are being discussed with the federal government right now, but it would be, you know, on the order of at least tens of millions of dollars for a city like Edmonton, potentially into the low hundreds, depending on pricing and availability. And how many units can be acquired in the short term. So you can easily extrapolate from that to a national scale. That is significant, but in the grand scheme of a multi-hundred-billion-dollar response to this, and instead of spending money on shelters and money on short-term accommodations and renting spaces, if we buy them, it will be a lot cheaper for the taxpayer over the medium term. And if we're all going to be paying this back for the next generation anyway, let's get best bang for our buck and help some hoteliers who are really struggling exit their properties at the same time. So it's a win-win-win, and it sounds like there's will from the federal government to look at a serious proposal here. The discussions have been very positive, and I've got further conversations with federal ministers tomorrow on this. So it's advancing very quickly. But it's great to have the whole Federation of Canadian Municipalities and the big city mayors pulling in the same direction around this urgent need.
Okay. Next up, we'll go to the phone from CBC, Michelle Bellefontaine. I think you're on mute, Michelle.
Oh, sorry, I thought you guys were going to unmute. Hi, Mayor Iveson. My question is, when you're talking about housing vulnerable populations, as you well know, it's not just housing, it's also staffing. So is there kind of a component for what you're hoping for that would also have some of these units staffed by people to assist vulnerable people that maybe have other issues like addictions or mental health issues, that kind of thing?
Well, for this, for supportive housing to be successful and for people to remain housed, support services need to come to people in their homes. And we know that all the evidence shows that, well, that does come at a cost. It's much cheaper than meeting people's needs reactively through the emergency room at the Royal Alex or through the justice system. And so that's one of the reasons why Alberta Health Services has consistently committed to provide healthcare embedded services, and that even as they face other budget pressures and austerity, they recognize that it is in their interest to reduce demand for their most expensive reactive services, to embed preventative and support services in housing. So we have that commitment from Alberta Health Services. There are other services around addiction support, which the province is also investing in, that would make sense to be embedded in these services. And then there's a lot of money being spent today right now on a variety of different day programs and other support services. So I believe the money's in the system, but it would fall ultimately to the provincial government to align those resources to support folks staying housed. And again, we would look to the federal government to make that happen with the provinces and territories to the satisfaction of Canadian taxpayers to know that the housing investments were going to be successful. Again, 100% believe there's a return on investment there to the provincial taxpayer, as we've articulated for many years, and as the evidence from facilities like Ambrose Place has shown time and time again, there is a value for money case there. And then I guess the last point I'd make on this is actually I had a chance to chat with some of the residents at the invitation of one of the elders down at Camp Hekawiwin last week. Had a chance to hear from people about the need that they have, not just for shelter, but for community. And that one of the positive things that they've experienced in the camp is a sense of support being brought to them, a sense of community, a sense of safety. And clearly, for the housing to be successful, that same sense of community and you know, the warm embrace of supports to help people who are struggling with mental health and addictions challenges and other complexity in their lives, that you need to bring all of that support to the housing, but that clearly everyone agrees, including the camp residents, that based on their demands, that suitable housing as well as the support services is what is necessary to better meet their needs in general terms, but especially in light of the pandemic.
Thank you for your question, Michelle. Next, we'll go to Dustin Cook at Post Media.
Hi, thank you very much for taking my question. I will ask about housing. Mr. Mayor, how confident are you that your call for this 10-week plan to end homelessness will come to fruition? And what is the city doing in the background to support this ahead of support from the federal and provincial governments, you know, in terms of if there's rezoning possible or necessary, or possible kitchens in hotels needed, or supervised consumption services, those things being done behind the scenes right now?
He's doing a lot of work with our existing housing providers, and it's also very active in our real estate department to look at what the different options out there would be. And we're communicating that through the FCM and with the federal government to share sort of what implementation could look like here in Edmonton. Clearly, it may not be possible to get all of the units, even if we get the green light from the government and the dollars flow immediately on a sort of emergency basis, which is certainly what we're calling for. That doesn't mean that we'd have hundreds of units open 10 weeks from now, but we're also looking at what the interim short-term accommodations could be to house people appropriately and help stabilize them to be able to bring them into that more permanent housing as it comes online. And so looking at the phasing and staging of that and what sort of facilities could be brought to bear for mat housing in the interim, in order to ultimately route people to the permanent units. Now, to the first part of your question, I'm quite optimistic based on what we're hearing from Ottawa that the need is understood, the opportunity is seen as multiply beneficial in terms of acquiring units at a kind of a once-in-a-lifetime discount. And that there's an opportunity to achieve a step change in Canadian housing policy for the dignity of people who have been left out of the sort of Canadian social contract up to this point, and that there's no time like a pandemic to make sure that happens to prevent it from becoming a human tragedy in those vulnerable communities. So I'm quite optimistic that we will get relief and support from the federal government. The question is really speed and scale, but I think something's coming, and our advice is no time like now to go big and get it done.
Thank you, Dustin. Next up, Jessica Robb with Global.
Hi there, thank you for taking my question as well. I'm wondering, you already did mention Camp Pekawaywen down in Rossdale, and I'm just wondering how those discussions have been going, if there's an end date that has been set, or what's next for them down there. Thanks.
I understand the city is in meetings with them today, and so there may be an update soon. Discussions continue about how to best handle the sanitation needs and public health supports that are necessary, but the city is also sort of trying to be as supportive as possible without enabling it becoming a permanent encampment, because we believe there is a better solution which we're working towards, which is transitional housing and permanent housing for all people experiencing homelessness, including people who are have chosen the camp for now, but who, having spoken to them, also agree that there has to be a better solution. So the city is in conversations with the camp today, and I appreciate that they have amplified our council's call for rapid action from senior orders of government to deliver housing this winter. So as to their intentions, I don't have an update on that, but perhaps after the meeting with city officials today, there'll be more to say on that.
Thank you, Jessica. Next question in the room, David Awas, CTV.
Mine is about the letter, Mr. Mayor. I'm sure there'll be other questions, but generally the letter from the minister regarding police funding. Your response, first of all, to it.
Sure. Well, it's interesting because as Minister of Municipal Affairs, the minister was very keen on scrubbing down our budgets and reducing our costs as a way to address pressure around taxes, which we've certainly been doing. Now, as Minister of Justice, to suggest that we should not be looking at our largest cost center, which is policing, seems a bit ironic to me, particularly that given that the government of Alberta reduced their commitment to policing by $5 million last year. So we have to look at all parts of our budget, and we have to think systemically and strategically. And as we've thought about potentially reallocating some resources from policing into crime prevention and community safety initiatives, in fact, I saw the minister say in an interview with an outlet last week that he agrees with the premise that there needs to be investment in those other services. And so, first of all, I'd like to ask whether we can have the $5 million back if defunding police is not to be encouraged. But if that's not going to happen, and we can all guess the likelihood of that, what I'd like to see is if the government of Alberta is ready to spend that $5 million on the very housing actions that we're asking for that will improve community safety, reduce demand for policing services, reduce demand for the minister's own jails, and reduce the province's principal cost pressure area, which is healthcare. Because there is a better and systematic response to this that would be strategic, and I'd like to have that conversation with the minister, because I think that's what Edmontonians expect of their elected officials, is for us to find solutions to complex strategies rather than what we're seeing here.
Thank you, David. Next up is Emily Mertz with Global.
Hi, Mayor Iveson. Thanks so much. This is a follow-up to David's question. In an interview today, Mr. Madu said he supports cities looking for efficiencies in police forces, but doesn't think using, quote, calls to defund the police as, quote, an excuse to cut police budgets. He doesn't think that's the right path. And that if leaders take that approach, it signals to him that they don't need the 2 provincial police grants. So I'm wondering what you say to that. The NDP is calling it a threat.
Well, frankly, we dealt with a lot of this over the last year. And I think, again, what Edmontonians expect of all of their elected officials is for us to work together respectfully to solve complex problems in our community, rather than oversimplifying issues. In this case, part of the challenge is that Edmonton and Calgary, in fact, already received the least on a per capita basis, and that was before the cuts in the most recent budget from the provincial government. All other communities receive somewhere between 10 and 30% of their policing costs covered. And up until recently, many received all of their policing costs covered through the RCMP contract, and rural taxpayers paid nothing, and people in small communities paid nothing. So a fact that's important to get on the table is that on a per capita basis, Edmontonians or Calgarians are carrying the freight, and we're policing Northern Alberta and Southern Alberta's inner cities respectively. And so, if anything, there should be a conversation about provincial support for the load that we carry in these large cities. Now, I would be very happy to see those dollars effectively invested in community supports, mental health programs for people, and housing, again, repeatedly, our most urgent call for systemic change that would help improve community safety and well-being outcomes and lower government costs for all orders of government. So if there's a better investment strategy and the province is willing to come to the table and talk about where they're prepared to invest strategically to help Edmonton and Calgary and our taxpayers more effectively carry the inner city loads that we do here, and organized crime and cybercrime, where it also tends to concentrate in the large cities. That would be the level of debate I would like to have with this minister about systemic change to policing and community safety and well-being. And again, I think that's what Edmontonians expect of all of their elected officials. I'm willing to go there. I hope the minister will too.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. That's all the time we have for questions today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Have a great day.
Really, somebody's got to ask the audit question.
Am I able to jump in with an audit question?
Or, yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Is that Emily?
No, this is Jessica.
Jessica, okay.
Perfect. Sorry, I thought we were going to do another round. Thank you. I'm just looking, I guess, for your response to the audit report and if you think that there are too many managers.
I called for, along with members of the audit committee and members of council, for this analysis to take place based on repeated questions that have come forward about what's the right amount of supervision to ensure accountability and performance versus what would be more than you would need. And clearly the auditor has found that there are more supervisors than we need in this organization. And so as we look to manage the workforce, which we're going to have to do through a period of great transition here with COVID and the fiscal pressures that we're under, we are likely to shed positions in the coming budget cycle, if not before. We already have had to over the summer. I'm going to be looking for and pushing for, starting at the audit committee and into budget this fall, for a good number of those positions to be supervisory positions. We're going to need a lot of cooperation, unusual cooperation from our labor unions, because quite a significant number of those supervisory positions are union positions. They're not all management positions. Clearly, we're going to have to draw from both, but we're going to need some cooperation from labor in order to rationalize some of the supervisory positions that otherwise would be protected in the collective agreements that are in place. So significant changes coming to this organization because of the budget pressures we're facing. That was already a reality before COVID. COVID has just accelerated it, and this audit simply gives us one more place to demand, as elected officials on behalf of the public, some restraint from this city administration, and we will have to shed some supervisory positions across the corporation to bring things back into balance, and we'll have to do that sooner rather than later. And I'll be pushing for that at the audit committee and through to the budget this fall.